Welcome to Data Forward, the podcast that keeps you ahead in the fast-evolving world of enterprise AI and data management. We bring you expert insights, actionable strategies, and the latest trends to help you stay on top. Ready to shape the future of data? Let's Data Forward.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Data Forward. I'm your host, Ramon Chen. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Excel Data. And today I'm very excited to have with me Dan Power, industry expert in all things data management, data governance, data quality. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Ramon, and really glad to be here. Really excited to talk with you. And looking at what you're planning to ask about, these are some of the things that are closest to my heart. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it with you.
Well, before we get started, Dan, a belated congratulations for being named Corinthium's top 100 data thought leaders.
Thank you. It was kind of unreal when it happened. And at the same time, I've been working in this field for longer than I care to admit. So it was a nice recognition.
Absolutely. Well-deserved. Well-deserved.
Thank you.
So why don't we tell the audience a little bit about your career? You and I have known each other for many, many years. You were originally at Dun Bradstreet, and then you struck out on your own. And then, even handled master data management for companies such as Apple. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and experience?
Sure. It's a good starting point. I mean, obviously, I did things before I joined D&B, but that was really the first place that I saw the critical importance data, in this case, D&B data, which is a third-party provider, obviously, could have for large companies. Because the important thing I think it brought was triangulation. Here's our internal view of this customer or this supplier or whomever, but that's just what we know as a company. There's a whole outside world, and we want to know what they think. And so D&B is an aggregator, and they pull all that information together. They add their own proprietary content like credit scores and so on. And then they allow you to bring that in and store it into, an enterprise platform. I did a lot of work with the Oracle Customer Data Hub in its early days. And that was kind of groundbreaking at the time because you could do that triangulation of internal and external data very easily. And at the time when I left, I was going out on my own, and I started a company called Hub Designs, which I still think back fondly on. That was where I did a lot of my fun work, early days about data strategy, master data management, data quality, data governance. And, the people at D&B were actually great because they would walk me into some of their biggest clients and ask me to help them to get them ready to the point where they would be able to use D&B as an external data provider. Because not everybody's ready to do that triangulation. If you're so used to just seeing what your own internal systems tell you, like CRM or ERP or whatever, opening that up to have a third-party data provider alongside of it to do that triangulation is something new, and it takes some time to get used to. But it really helps with, anything really, marketing, credit management, data management, even just simple identification of duplicate data and, merging them. So I really enjoyed that 10 years. I did it up until about 2017. I think after 10 years of doing anything, you can get burned out. So I was actually very happy to join State Street Bank, and I was the head of data governance for their global markets division, which mostly dealt with capital markets, foreign exchange trading, security financing, security transactions. So that was very eye-opening too, because it was, being reintroduced to corporate politics and organizational design challenges and, the kind of infighting. It really helped me realize that data is just one piece of the mix. You have to have, obviously, organization and people, and actually that turns out to be the most challenging usually. Obviously, this process, you have both manual and automated processes, which are usually not perfect, so they can lead to problems with the data. And then you have the technology, obviously, that's usually the kind of infrastructure underneath everything. And then you have the data, because the data is not going to be right if any one of those other three things are wrong. So it's not a matter of having things perfect. It's more, is it fit for purpose? Can we use it as is, or do we need to apply some intervention from a data quality perspective or whatever. And I most recently, after leaving State Street, was with Raymond James Financial down in St. Petersburg. Had a lot of fun with them. Really enjoyed it. Very complex challenges as they grew from being a smaller organization into being regulated by the Fed as a $100 billion in assets organization, the so-called Category 4. So the transition from being smaller to being a Category 4 institution in the eyes of the Fed requires a lot of new regulatory reports and infrastructure and so on, all of which depends on the data. So I enjoyed that a lot. And data is an important enterprise asset that doesn't always get treated as an asset. You have to have reusable, high quality, high integrity data flowing smoothly, so the data itself doesn't create glitches and anomalies and, based on problems with the people or the process or the technology. Obviously, it's people use the word data factory all the time. And now that we're adding AI, I think that becomes a fifth component of that mix. You've got the people and the process and the technology and the data, all of which feeds the AI. So
Yeah.
it's not a new element, obviously, but the combination of expanding the classic people, process, and technology to include both data and AI is going to require some rethinking of things by enterprise companies, Enterprise America.
Yeah.
And I'm really looking forward to that. I'm hoping my next chapter after Raymond James will be something along the line of supporting and governing AI.
Yeah, I have no doubt, Jan. Thanks so much for that. And you really wrapped a lot based upon your career into sort of the context of the evolving data landscape, which is fantastic. And also your experiences in financial services are going to be very relevant for our audience, because I'm sure a lot of people are interested in the regulations that you described in terms of companies becoming $100 billion companies and so on and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about now sort of the traditional way of doing things, right? You and I have been in this business for, well, too many years, you care to admit, but, data quality has not really evolved very much over the last 20 years. It's always been fix this, kind of almost reactionary.
Mm-hmm.
And then data cataloging, data governance has been around, and there was a huge amount of investment placed in it when GDPR came out. Every CDO rushed to buy a catalog because they wanted to know what all of their assets were. In your estimation, how has the world evolved since then, right? Especially with the advent of AI, are traditional data quality tools and data cataloging, the way things are being done, still appropriate?
Let me say no, because one of the things that has plagued companies so far is they've taken a very siloed approach, not only to their data, where they say, "Hey, we've acquired 10 companies over the last 10 years. We have 10 silos, and now the private client group is doing one thing, and the capital markets group is doing another. They don't have a shared data foundation." And the data catalogs themselves, if you just look at the tools, they're very flat. They're very kind of single dimensional, and they require a lot of manual care and feeding. So if you look at the kind of business process world, which has still got a lot of manual processes out there, emails, Excel spreadsheets, weekly meetings, etc. And then you try to, look at the data governance side of things. It's not, proactive. Things don't kind of jump out at you and say, "Hey, we've got a problem here on aisle 7." In your data, they tend to be more like reference materials, but you have to think, I better go visit the library and I better go look on aisle J and, look up the data about this transaction or this system or whatever. It doesn't notify you. It doesn't do anything for you. There's just a lack of automation, which means that not only do you have this big, honking catalog that does, provide a lot of good capabilities, but it requires a team of people to do the care and feeding and a lot of manual processes. Like the catalogs aren't, self-curating. And, that I read a lot of science fiction. So I'm always thinking about, well, what are things going to be like in 20 years or 50 years or whatever? But the idea of applying agentic AI and taking those techniques and applying them to data management, to me, it's a crying need, because otherwise you need such a large team to do the care and feeding and maintenance of those catalogs. It becomes untenable. And it's really
Exactly.
hard to point to the value when you say, okay, well, I'm going to provide you some value as your chief data officer. But first, you have to go out and swallow this horse pill of data management burden that
Yeah.
you have to apply first before you get any of that value. And most people will say, hey, the cure is worse than the disease here. I ain't going there.
Yeah.
That's too bureaucratic. That's too time consuming. That's too labor intensive. I don't have those people. Like what kind of people do I need to hire as data stewards or find internally and make data stewards? And what can they get done in the standard 40 hours a week? Well,
Yeah.
anytime you can boost their productivity, first of all, you have to find them. But assuming you have them on board, you don't need so many, but you have to
Yeah.
boost the productivity of the ones you do have so they become experts in the systems and the data, and they can be leveraged so that you don't have to have them doing everything kind of manually, lifting and shoveling all day
Exactly.
long.
Yeah.
Let's bring some power tools to the mix. And I really like
Yeah.
the approach you guys are taking with the agentic data management, because that means it's easier to automate some of those tasks, and you have intelligent
Exactly.
agents that are out there working on your behalf 24/7, and that you can refine over time without having to have that huge army of curators feeding the beast.
Exactly. And it's not just us, obviously.
Of
Everybody's
course.
using agentic. It's agentic this, agentic that. And even the traditional data catalog vendors are putting that automation and reducing the labor. But
Not
one of the
fast
things,
enough, though.
not fast enough, right? Well, exactly. But one of the things that is interesting that we're seeing evolving is people are kind of cataloging blind, right? It's
Mhm.
very odd, and it's always been odd to me that you would try to catalog every asset that you have without actually knowing whether it's valuable to the end user or not, right?
Right.
It's to your example, a library is being created, but if nobody ever looks at that dusty book in the corner, is the juice worth the squeeze, right?
Right.
Relative to the amount of catalog. So
And that's
really,
what the business says. They say, we don't
exactly,
think it's worth it because, we're not going to get any value out of
exactly,
cataloging. I mean, sure, if you could do it automatically really quickly, then maybe we could build some value off of that. But the step of doing
exactly.
it itself doesn't add a lot of value.
Exactly. And so, how do you understand value? Well, you need to see the operational pipelines. You need to
Mhm.
see where the data came from, what the quality of that data is, and what the lineage is and the impact downstream. Only then do you know whether the business truly values that data and whether it's actually delivering the value and the outcome relative to. So then you could say, okay, well, maybe this is worth converting into a data product, right? And that's our next topic. So getting visibility into that is almost a precursor to what should I be cataloging thoroughly, right? And spending my valuable hours, albeit using agentic, right, to do the acceleration.
Right.
So you worked at Dun Bradstreet. We would call it the OG data products company. I've interviewed your former colleague, Malcolm Hawker, and others that you used to work with at Dun Bradstreet. And they really have the data factory down to science, right? Being able to curate that DUNS number that's dependent upon by downstream by all these companies, and obviously they're a customer of Excel data, so we're very proud of that. Tell us a little bit about the mindset of creating a data product in this day and age.
It's a great question because I came from the world of ERP and manufacturing. And I almost think of it as, what are all my components, the individual parts that will go into this product, and knowing what they are. You'd never dream of going onto the manufacturing line and saying, I'm not really sure what all the pieces are.
Yeah,
That obviously you'd have an inventory of available components, which would be the data elements in this case. And then you have what they call a bill of materials, which is how am I going to put these components together to make the product? And that bill of materials design, things can have multiple levels. You could have one part that's being used in 17 different products. So that discipline, that process of product management actually turns out to be very helpful in data management, because the data product, whatever it might be, maybe it's just a subassembly that's going to be used widely. Maybe it's something like it's an end result, like an income statement that will be going to, the regulators or the SEC or, the investing public. Those things end up having a lot of trust placed on them, and you obviously want to make sure they will stand up to that scrutiny. So you have to have that very disciplined approach. Not everything has to be a data product, obviously, because some things just, it's not worth it, but things that are either critical outputs in and of themselves, or they're critical components of something else downstream that will depend on them, they should be managed that way. We need to know the inventory of the data elements and as much about those data elements as we can. So that's like a product spec for a component that's being used in a machine. And you have to know, what does the output look like? So mapping the inputs and knowing the outputs, and having metrics around it. So you can't measure, what's that saying? You can't manage what you don't measure.
Exactly.
You have to be able to do that, to say, well, we have a 99.9% trust score on this data product, because we measure the inputs as they come in, we assemble them into the data product, we have metrics around that, and then we can measure the quality of the output. Even simple things that people just don't currently think about, because like you have 25 inputs coming in, how many of them are blank? Do a completeness score. You can weight it, because some of those are more important than others. And if this one is blank, that's a much bigger deal than if this other one is blank. So just creating simple metrics and then tracking them over time. Using, I don't know what there's a Japanese term around quality that I'm probably not remembering right. But the idea is that you kind of measure and manage the quality of the input data and the output data, and then you'll be able to say, if a regulator or someone in corporate finance or management, the CEO, hey, how are we doing on the quality of that data? Well, as a matter of fact, we saw a big increase in the scores from last month to this month. It went from 92%, which is okay, to 97%, which is great. And here's our plan for getting to 99.9%. You've got to know when to stop, though, because people kind of naively believe that perfection is achievable.
Exactly.
And yes, it's achievable, but sometimes it gets to be prohibitively expensive to get that last 0.1% perfection. So knowing when to stop is also important.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point that you bring up. And that's what we're seeing here at Excel Data as well. One of our customers uses our data quality score, a reliability score, we call it, because it extends beyond data quality, as a company-wide metric. Mm-hmm. And Dun Bradstreet, I recently did a presentation jointly with a colleague from Dun Bradstreet at Gartner, talked about how they actually gamify across all of their countries, competing to see who could have the highest quality data. So pride and ownership of data quality being a sort of company-wide incentive and initiative, not just for the data engineering team or the chief data officer, but everybody taking pride in having responsible and clean, high-quality data. That data can only be uncovered, again, as our earlier conversation, through the flow and the operational observability, whereas the data catalog does not really have any information relative to what's happening in real time operationally. Now, let's think about this as well. Those metrics become actually the SLAs and the data contracts, if you will, of these data products, right? So what you just described is absolutely critical. So let's switch a little bit to financial services, right? Obviously, there's a lot of regulations, and compliance is a big, big mandate. You discussed, Raymond James's concept of, being $100 billion sort of company and having to meet those regulations. How are you seeing those regulations amp up? And how does data play a role in satisfying those regulations?
Well, to me, there's two kinds. There's things that are new that everybody has to comply with as of a certain date. Like GDPR was a good example of that. There was an implementation date, and from that date on, you had to be in compliance. So you could be actually quite large fines for non-compliance. And then there's things that have been around for a while that you never had to comply with yet, but now you do, or you will. 100 billion falls into that category because, when the enterprise total assets on the balance sheet over a 4-quarter average exceed 100 billion, then that's when the Fed kind of puts their hand up and say, okay, you're category 4 now. Right. But either way, you have to really have confidence and trust in the data to be able to send it to a regulator and say, this is our balance sheet, this is our income statement, this is our statement of cash flow, sources and uses, whatever. And there's a lot of complexity and knowing how to manage complexity, and that's where that bill of materials idea comes back. Because if you have an output or a data product, and you have a very good catalog of it, which is the beginning of the bill of materials, then you can start to add the operational flows. You can look at choke points. You can look at data quality issues that are being introduced by code. You can look at data quality issues from manual data entry, and you can start, it's all about being able to answer the regulators' questions. When they look at this and say, something doesn't look right here, because a lot of those people at the regulators came from industry. I mean, I have tons of friends who now work for the Fed, and the thing they do is, something doesn't smell right. So they have a hunch, and then they will ask a very pointed question that says, show me the data lineage from this report backward to all the source systems.
Yeah.
And you need to be able to do that in 24 to 48 hours. So, one of my earlier times at State Street, for example, they asked about a particular lineage, and we couldn't do it. We hadn't done that work yet. So we had to, make sure everything in the catalog was up to date, and then we ended up pouring through tons of source code, tens of thousands of lines of source code. It was a two-person effort that took 2 months, so 4-man months, so 4-person months, to untangle that lineage and put the picture together in a way that could support a lineage diagram. And lineage is not the be-all, end-all. It's just one of the things, but they will ask. They will say, show us the data lineage for these 5 data elements going backward. Or transaction testing. That'll be another one. They'll say, hey, we know that you have this flow where it goes from the source system to a data lake, to a data warehouse, to the reporting platform, to the report. We want to look at, a snapshot of that data at every one of those 6 points where it flows through. So for this set of customers, they'll give you a subset. For this transaction date, they'll give you a date. You need to show us the slice of the data at each of those 6 waypoints along the way towards that end destination. And by the way, this shouldn't take you a month to do. You should be able to do this. Exactly. And so a lot of times we would have to scramble to do things like that. But if you know it's coming, you shouldn't have to scramble. You should have platforms and capabilities that support that in advance, so that as you not only build the reports, you're building that lineage capability, you're building that transaction testing, and you have the data quality controls and other types of controls, process controls in place, so you can do a good risk management job and have the perspective of, what are they likely to ask? Can we meet those? What things are they likely to ask that we can't meet? And can we go build those capabilities? So I view the regulators as a partner. They're telling us, where we haven't necessarily thought of everything, or haven't done a good job, or there's aspects of things we missed, or there's risk management steps we need to take. They typically write up what are called matters requiring attention, or MRAs. The really critical ones are matters requiring immediate attention. And if it's super critical, like they're afraid you might actually shut down the world economy, then it becomes a cease and desist, or consent decrees. Usually more likely, like Citi got hit with hundreds of $1 million in fines over the past few years. And part of it was they were given consent decrees, which are consent orders, which were quite important, and they weren't able to meet them. It took them longer to satisfy those regulatory concerns than they promised. And so they were hit with additional fines just for that. So in terms of building capability, and to me, AI it's not the silver bullet, but it's a good, helpful tool, because you're able to do things faster. Even if you're just a data quality engineer, hey, can I write code? Sure, I could do it the old-fashioned way and sit down and write procedural code that tests and if then else statements. But why would I want to do that when I can simply describe the capability that I need and have an agent built for me that will implement that capability in a framework that is extendable and sustainable over time. And if you do that, then the regulators are not only going to get their questions answered quicker, but they'll have more confidence, because you'll go to the table with more of your act together, more in order, more buttoned up than you otherwise would be, which is only going to inspire confidence in you and in the regulator.
Yeah, I mean, you've just described exactly why all of the companies that we work with have invested in data observability, because the foundation is exactly what you described, monitoring every single stage, showing the lineage, the pipelines, the sources, the time series of the audit of how that data traveled, what happened to it, ultimately all along the stages of the data factory or the supply chain hitting its destination. And just putting the word agentic in front of it isn't going to make it magically happen if the
Right.
plumbing and the monitors are not already in place. So data observability forms the foundation, and then the agentic layers, the automation and the autonomy and the speeding up of the manual processes. But some of the mind-blowing things, and as you know, Dan, we recently had Autonomous 25, which is our customer conference, and we unveiled agentic data management. And the agentic data management can now do things like, traditionally, you'd get a business analyst who had the sort of requirements, the regulations, and the compliance that they had to match up. And then they would meet with a data engineer, talk about it. Data engineer would look at that, try and interpret it, and then map that to the actual flow of the operations and the pipelines to say, these are the checkpoints that we need. The incredible thing now with the power of these LLMs and agentic is you can literally take that spec or that regulatory document, import it, give it to as a knowledge base feed into the agent. And then the agent already knows, because it's got the data observability foundation, all of your assets and all of your various points in the pipeline. And you can ask it the question based upon the regulations as defined in this document. Where are my exposures? What monitors should I put in? And show me how I can proactively cut off any issues to ensure that my compliance reporting is 100% accurate. I mean, that's kind of mind-blowing to me.
It is mind-blowing. And the reason that's so important is a lot of times the legacy systems we have out there, it's not at all uncommon for big companies anyway to have, mainframe COBOL systems that were built 30 years ago. And all the programmers that built that thing are gone.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of documentation written in the first place. So you can introspect those things and, do queries and understand the data. I call it Chernobyling, because essentially you treat that original source system as, Chernobyl that has had a meltdown, and you basically want to build a shield around it. And, you take things out and you put things in a very controlled way. You understand, you may not understand that system completely, but you understand it well enough based on what goes in and what comes back out again, that you're able to, deal with it and eventually phase it out maybe. But in the meantime, it's no longer this big, looming risk hanging over you. And a lot of the other, they are legacy systems, but they were built more recently, maybe than 30 years ago. Maybe it's an old version of a HR, and payroll management system, or an ERP or a CRM. You're going to upgrade them eventually, but in the meantime, they're driving some pretty critical outputs. So, and we don't need to govern everything to the same level of completeness. I mean, I like to think of a kind of low scale, everybody on the road should have a driver's license registration, level of governance to, on the other end, if this is driving a major regulatory report like the 2052A, we need to understand this system really, really well and how it flows across the enterprise. And then in between, when people say, well, I know I can't be at the low end of the scale, but I don't want to be at the high end of the scale, is defining the right mix of, well, what governance capabilities and, cataloging do we need to do? Because, your thing is driving important outputs. They're not critical outputs, but they're still important. So, getting away from the, black and white thinking of catalog everything and everything's important. And, we have 100 critical data elements on this one report. Yeah, that's fine, but that's a naive way of doing it. You have to be able to kind of think about things in more granular and holistic ways, and at the same time, not with the black and white thinking that everything is critical. Some data elements really are more critical than others.
Yeah, but you need visibility to understand that, and
Yes.
I certainly feel that. So, I have huge empathy and also, great respect for the chief data officer today, right? Not only did they have to evolve their thinking from being a defensive, catalog everything, govern everything, and now turn into an operational use of data rather than the defensive use for compliance, have it operationally inject and increase revenue. And having better data quality should naturally lead to better business outcomes. So that's what they have in the mix. But now they're also responsible to a certain degree. Some are CDAO, right, or AIO, responsible for the data that feeds AI, right? So that's another responsibility that they're taking over. What are your thoughts relative to how the role of the CDO? You certainly have been an advisor to many CDOs and given sort of the governance landscape and the advice. You actually coined the term, and I love it. There's a symptom out there that people are thinking minimum viable data. How do I just get by and meet the regulatory requirements, right? Tell me why that term that you coined is not the right way to think about things.
Well, it's just too limited. I mean, you're talking about, if you think of it as a 2x2 grid, you're just looking at like the bottom left-hand corner. And really the value add is going to be in the top right-hand corner. You have to go beyond the kind of minimum viable data that keeps you out of jail. Well, that's not a great life. When your data is just keeping you out of jail,
Right.
it's not delivering the insights. It's not delivering the increased revenue. I mean, we've all had experiences as consumers. You get 2 copies of the catalog, being delivered to your home. Your billing address is not quite right. Whatever it is. So there's lots of opportunity to go from good enough to good enough to drive results. And I think the minimum viable data approach guarantees failure in some ways. It may not be the failure that gets you in jail, but the data is not going to be as reliable. The data is not going to be as trustworthy as it would be if you applied. Shoot for that B. You don't have to get an A on every course, but you should at least shoot for a B. Because things drive other things. So if you get a C instead and say, I'm going to go with the minimum viable data, then what about the downstream things that depend on that data? Now you could see some amplification of, well, it's like the old saying, the shoe was lost, the horse was lost, the rider was lost, the battle was lost, because those downstream things depend on the quality and integrity of the upstream data. And guess what? They're not really there with the minimum viable data. And you don't always know what those downstream things will be in the future. Someone comes along and builds a dashboard or a report or an AI that depends on that upstream data, and it isn't quite right. We had weird situations where at State Street, for example, they had one system where it was only on Good Friday, but all the debits would flip to be credits and all the credits would flip to be debits.
Oh, really?
So anyone downstream who relied on that data, Good Friday's a financial holiday typically, but the systems were still running. And for some reason, they flipped all the transaction amounts to the opposite sign. And as a result, the downstream systems got very confused. And we could never figure out exactly why. That's the problem with complexity. Once you reach a certain level of complexity, it's very hard to be sure that you've really discovered the root cause, because guess what? Good Friday comes up again next year and it's still happening. You thought you fixed it. So what we ended up doing in that case was we just said, okay, on Good Friday only, use the previous day's data. Just copy it one more time. It's a holiday anyway. Nobody's transacting. And we'll carry that over to the downstream systems instead of letting the systems run that day. Or disregard the data. So I guess my point is that complexity feeds complexity, and the AI systems downstream that are going to be acting as agents autonomously, driving revenue, they're customer facing or regulator facing or whatever they're doing, they really have to be able to rely. I mean, it's that old saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. Well, I think, I love to just sort of zoom in on your thoughts that, today, unfortunately, and it's not necessarily the CDO's fault. They're limited with resources. They don't have the right tools, and they're shooting for a C to stay out of jail, which is totally understandable. I try to stay out of jail too if I were a CDO. But getting to a B, as you described, should be the goal, right? To be able to at least also achieve revenue generation through trusted quality data, operational, make the CEO happy, because you're not just, preventing fines, but you're actually improving the top line. But there's this sort of niggling thought, and one of the reasons I joined Excel Data through many years of being in master data management, as you well know, was that I've always been bothered by the fact that the outcome and the value wasn't directly tied to the improvement in quality or the mastering of the data, all of this work that all these tools were doing, because we couldn't see the end-to-end lineage to what was actually driving revenue. Now that's entirely possible. So I believe in this today's world, especially with agentic, you can turn it into an A, not on all the data, but the A on the data that's most relevant for the company. So I think we have now, in this point of time, very exciting, an opportunity to go from B, which is what people are shooting for the landscape of data, to A on only the data that you care about the most.
Right. And I would say that's appropriate because, if you think about it, the C's may be appropriate for somewhat unimportant things. Nothing critical is depending on them. The financial statements aren't being driven by that. There may not be that many of them out there in the end, but, the B is really, hey, this is pretty important. Some things are being driven by it, but, the A is really for, hey, if you don't get this right, then revenue is going to suffer, or our reputation will suffer, or we'll get a fine from the regulator, or, there'll be a GDPR, subject request that we can't meet. Where the outcomes are critical is really where the penalties are critical. And that could be foregone revenue, or it could be, fined in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's all about how much what I call data archaeology you can do. Going back over these legacy systems and interpreting them and loading their data into the catalog and creating AI agents that monitor the data quality coming out of them. You can't do it for everything, but you don't need to do it for everything. You kind of start at the top of the pyramid and you work your way down, and you understand that, you only have to get an A in the things that are kind of mission critical. Most things you really shoot for like a gentleman's B, and the things that really don't matter in the end, you say, guess what? This one's just not that important. It may be driving revenue, but it's in a very predictable way, and it doesn't, the revenue doesn't fluctuate up and down based on how quality the data is. And recognize too, there can be black swan events. We would see all the time someone would type an extra 3 zeros on a dollar amount because they didn't know it was being reported in thousands, or yesterday they put it in thousands, today they put it in dollars. So there's a fluctuation of 1,000%, or not 1,000%, but 1,000 times between yesterday's amount and today's amount. So you get more sophisticated about your approach to data management as you understand what are the downstream uses and the full supply chain of data, which obviously depends on the lineage. Then you have the ability to monitor data quality at every point along those flows. And you really understand the source systems, and you have everything registered in a catalog for the critical things. And so when issues arise, you are much more quickly able to solve them, or have an agent at least that can maybe solve them for you. Because we really need to get the human out of the loop in at least some cases, because we'd only have so many humans to go around. Everything can't be, well, give it to Billy, or give it to Sarah, or give it to Susan. There's got to be some things where, guess what, we don't need Billy or Sarah or Susan on these, because they're not, they're either not critical at all, or if they are critical, there's something the machine can handle, and we trust the machine to do it.
Exactly. Well, this has been fascinating, Dan. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure our listeners did as well. And I'm tremendously delighted that you talked about these topics, because your expertise and your experience in data management, specifically in the financial services industry, is absolutely invaluable. I would encourage everybody to reach out to Dan, right, on LinkedIn, and we'll provide contact information as we post this information in social media. Dan is an incredible expert. He really knows his stuff, as you saw here. Really reach out to him if you have any questions at all about data management, financial service regulatory regulations. Dan, thank you again. I hope you'll come on again soon in the future.
I'd be delighted to talk to you, and looking forward to continuing to work with you. It's been a very fruitful partnership over the years, and I couldn't be more thrilled.
Thank you so much, Dan, and we'll speak again real soon. Thank you so much.
Sounds good, Ramon. Thank you.
Welcome to Data Forward, the podcast that keeps you ahead in the fast-evolving world of enterprise AI and data management. We bring you expert insights, actionable strategies, and the latest trends to help you stay on top. Ready to shape the future of data? Let's data forward.